I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you have achieved the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of your career.
Right, like the ultimate goal.
Exactly. I'm talking about a success so massive, it basically defies belief. Your goal wasn't just, getting a corner office. You have physically conquered half a continent.
Which is wild to even think about.
It is. You've liberated 3 entire nations from the grip of a global, centuries-old empire. You are holding every single card.
Yeah, you have all the leverage.
Right. And you're being offered ultimate political power, the kind of absolute control that most historical figures would, and honestly often did, kill for.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you just walk away, you hand over the reins, you pack your bags, and you leave the continent entirely.
It completely shatters every expectation we have of a conqueror.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the broad sweep of history, the books are just overflowing with liberators who very quickly, almost instinctively, pivot into becoming dictators.
Yeah, power corrupts, right?
Exactly. The psychological pull of power is just gravitational. So stepping down, completely voluntarily, at the height of your influence, is the ultimate historical anomaly.
And that anomaly is exactly what we're focusing on in today's deep dive. We are exploring the life of José de San Martín, and we're relying on his extensive Wikipedia biography as our foundation for this.
It's a fascinating source to dig into.
It really is. The mission for today is to reverse engineer the mind of a master tactician. We want to understand how he pulled off some of the most, impossible logistical military feats in history.
Yeah.
And crucially, why he consciously chose exile over a crown.
Right, and looking closely at these sources, you realize San Martin wasn't just, a fighter swinging a sword. He was a meticulous systems thinker.
A planner.
Very much so. He understood that true enduring power lies in how you apply knowledge, how you synthesize disparate resources, and really how you engineer a self-sustaining system.
So less of a crusader and more of a project manager.
Essentially, yeah. He approached liberation not as a glorious crusade, but as a massive logistical puzzle.
Which is exactly why this matters to you, listening right now. Whether you are, say, managing an overwhelming project at work or trying to navigate complex organizational politics, or you're simply fascinated by the absolute limits of human endurance and the human ego, San Martin's life is a blueprint.
It really is a masterclass in strategy.
Strategy, organizational resilience, and knowing when your presence in a room is actually hindering the mission. But to understand how he dismantled the Spanish Empire, we first have to understand how he became one of their most lethal assets.
Right, because his origin story is entirely embedded within the machinery he would eventually tear down.
He started on the inside.
Exactly. He was born in 1778 in Yapeyú, Argentina, but his family relocated to Spain when he was just a child. By the age of 11, he is already enrolled as a cadet in the Spanish military.
11 years old. That's wild.
Yeah, he literally grows up inside the imperial system.
And he builds an incredibly distinguished career there, right? Like, he fights the Moors in North Africa. He gets captured by the British Navy during the French Revolution.
Right, spends time as a prisoner of war.
Yeah, and then the Peninsular War breaks out. Spain is fighting Napoleon's forces, and San Martin earns a gold medal for his actions at the Battle of Bailén. So he isn't some fringe rebel. He is a highly decorated, highly competent insider.
Oh, completely. He knows their tactical playbook because he helped write it.
Right. So what changes?
Well, what's fascinating here is how historians attempt to explain his sudden, massive pivot. Because in 1811, at the absolute height of his career, he abruptly resigns.
Just quits.
Just quits. He sails to London, then back to South America, offering his services to the revolutionary government in Buenos Aires. And the sources outline 3 historical theories for this defection.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is just a straightforward patriotic pull, like he simply missed his native land and wanted to fight for its freedom.
I have to be honest, I buy that the least.
Really? Why is that?
Well, a guy who leaves Argentina at age 7 and spends his entire formative life fighting for the Spanish crown doesn't just wake up 30 years later and casually decide to commit treason out of nostalgia. I mean, what are the other options?
Fair point. So the second theory is basically geopolitical cynicism. It suggests he was actually recruited as a British agent.
Wait, a British spy?
Yeah, because Great Britain had a massive economic incentive to see a free South America. It would break the Spanish trade monopoly and, open up vast new markets for British goods.
Okay, let's unpack this. The British agent theory feels a bit like a 19th century spy thriller, to be honest.
It does sound like a movie.
But the logic tracks. Still, you don't orchestrate the liberation of an entire continent just for British trade routes. There has to be a deeper ideological driver here, right?
Which brings us to the third theory, and this one is centered on the Enlightenment. During his time in Spain, San Martin was heavily influenced by the ideas of the Spanish Enlightenment.
Like liberty, equality, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and anti-absolutism. This theory argues that San Martin was actually fighting a continuous lifelong war against tyranny.
Ah, I see.
Right, so first, he fought the French when Napoleon represented absolute tyranny, but when the Spanish absolutist restoration occurred, the Spanish crown became the tyrant. So his core mission never actually changed.
The battleground merely shifted.
Precisely.
That makes a lot more sense. It's like a top-tier executive at
Yeah.
a massive legacy corporation. They've been there 20 years. They know all the trade secrets. They're pulling in massive bonuses. But they suddenly realize the company's core practices are completely opposed to their personal ethics.
Right, an ethical breaking point.
So they abruptly quit to join a scrappy, underfunded startup whose explicit mission is to bankrupt that exact legacy corporation. But I'm curious, was it purely these high-minded Enlightenment ideals? Or did San Martin just pragmatically see that the Spanish Empire was a sinking ship?
It was likely a synthesis of both, honestly, and it was driven by a highly sophisticated network. San Martin was fundamentally a pragmatist. He knew the Spanish military was stretched incredibly thin fighting in Europe.
They were distracted.
Very distracted. But crucially, while in Europe, he joined the Lodge of Rational Knights.
Which sounds like a fantasy guild.
It really does. But this wasn't just a social club. It was essentially an 18th century geopolitical intelligence network. It was a secret society of South Americans in Europe who were actively pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and plotting independence movements.
Wow, okay. So she wasn't acting on a whim at all.
Not at all. He was analyzing the geopolitical board with a network of operatives and making a highly calculated systemic move.
But when you make a move like that, the people at the startup don't automatically trust the ex-corporate guy. When he arrives in Buenos Aires in 1812, the revolutionary government is incredibly suspicious.
Understandably so.
Yeah, I mean, he talks like a Spaniard, he looks like a Spaniard, he just spent 20 years fighting for the king. They don't just hand him an army.
No, they give him a test. The local government asks him to build a professional cavalry unit, which eventually becomes the Regiment of Mounted Grenadiers. He basically has to prove his loyalty through raw competence and physical risk.
And he proves it almost immediately at the Battle of San Lorenzo. And we should note, he doesn't lead from the back here.
Oh, not at all. He's right in the thick of it.
During this battle, his horse is actually killed, trapping his leg underneath it while a royalist soldier charges at him to finish the job. He is only saved because two of his soldiers physically throw themselves into the fight. And one of them, Juan Bautista Cabral, actually dies, saving San Martin's life.
Yeah, and that moment completely cements his legitimacy with the troops and the government. But while San Lorenzo proved his tactical skill in a localized fight, his true genius emerged when he looked at the macro strategy.
Right, the big picture.
Exactly. The revolutionary forces had been trying to attack the royalist stronghold in Peru by marching straight up through the harsh, mountainous terrain of Upper Peru.
Which didn't go well, I assume.
It was a disaster. 2 campaigns had already failed there. It was basically a meat grinder.
So San Martin looks at this repeated failure and completely changes the paradigm. He realizes that banging his head against the geographic wall of Upper Peru is just tactical suicide.
So what does he do?
He asks to be made governor of the Cuyo province, specifically in Mendoza, which borders the Andes. His plan is audacious. He says, let's ignore Upper Peru, build a massive army in Mendoza, cross the highest peaks of the Andes into Chile, liberate Chile, and then sail a navy up the coast to attack Peru by sea.
The scale of that pivot cannot be overstated. It's massive. And to execute it, he essentially turns the province of Cuyo into a total war economy. But he doesn't do it through brute tyranny. He does it through intense social engineering.
The logistics outlined in our sources are mind-bending. He emancipates slaves between the ages of 14 and 55 to serve in the infantry. He has hundreds of local women mobilized to weave military uniforms.
Every resource is tapped.
Yeah, but what I find most fascinating is the manufacturing side. He literally puts a priest, Father José Luis Beltran, in charge of a munitions factory with 700 men making rifles and horseshoes.
It's brilliant.
But how? How do you just snap your fingers and turn an agrarian province into a military-industrial complex without the local ruling class revolting?
Well, by identifying and repurposing transferable skills.
Yeah.
San Martin recognized that the Catholic Church was one of the few institutions at the time with rigorous bureaucratic discipline and organizational structure.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Father Beltran possessed an analytical, disciplined mind. San Martin didn't need a blacksmith for this. He needed a systems manager.
So he put a priest in charge of a factory.
By applying ecclesiastical discipline to a factory floor, he scaled production exponentially. He engineered the society so every single person had a specialized, compartmentalized role in the war effort.
Which culminates in early 1817 with the crossing of the Andes. I mean, this is like a modern-day moonshot project. It's logistically insane.
It really is.
He sends 5,000 men, plus thousands of mules and horses, hauling heavy artillery over freezing, jagged mountain passes. And he doesn't just send them up one path, he splits them across 6 different mountain passes simultaneously to confuse the royalist spies on the other side.
And the mechanism of survival here is astonishing. It took them nearly a month. They were surviving on dried meat and, get this, they ate raw garlic and onions specifically to dilate their blood vessels and combat altitude sickness.
Wait, raw onions?
Yeah, less than half their animals actually survived the journey.
This is where I struggle, though. You have an army made up of emancipated slaves who have every reason to distrust authority. You have drafted local citizens and political exiles. They are freezing, they're exhausted, and they're eating raw onions. How does a leader prevent an absolute catastrophic mutiny in those conditions?
Well, because mutiny thrives in a vacuum of preparation. San Martin prevented it through radical transparency and shared suffering.
You didn't just stay in the back.
Exactly. He didn't order them up the mountain while he stayed in a warm tent. He engineered their survival. Every soldier knew exactly why they were taking their specific route. When a leader provides a crystal clear vision and couples it with the exact, tangible tools required to survive, even if those tools are just dried beef and garlic, it builds a profound, unifying trust.
They knew he had a plan.
The army knew San Martin had calculated every single calorie and every single step.
So that unifying trust gets them over the mountains. But a theoretical machine eventually has to prove itself in reality. They come down into Chile, completely exhausted, and they immediately have to fight the Spanish royalists at the Battle of Chacabuco.
No rest at all.
None. San Martin plans a highly coordinated pincer movement, but one of his commanders, Bernardo O'Higgins, lets his emotions take over. O'Higgins rushes his attack for personal glory, throwing off the timing entirely.
Which forces San Martin to adapt on the fly. He ends up rushing his own column to support O'Higgins and ultimately securing the victory. But that moment of friction really foreshadows the greatest test this army would face. Because securing a victory when you have momentum is one thing, surviving a catastrophic failure is another entirely.
Which brings us to the disaster at Conchariata. San Martin's army is camped out. A spy warns them that the Spanish are going to attempt a surprise night attack, but there just isn't enough time to reposition.
The worst case scenario.
The royalists hit them in the dead of night. It is total chaos. 1,000 soldiers instantly scatter into the darkness. O'Higgins is shot, and San Martin's own assistant is killed right next to him.
And in almost any other historical context, a midnight ambush that shatters your lines is just the end of the campaign. The army dissolves into the countryside, and the war is basically over.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because it doesn't end. A commander named Los Heras manages an incredibly orderly retreat in the pitch black, saving 3,500 men. They fall back to Santiago, and then just weeks later, they meet the royalists again at the Battle of Maipú.
The turnaround is incredible.
It is. San Martin is observing the Spanish lines, realizes their tactical flaw, and supposedly says, "Osorio is clumsier than I thought. Today's triumph is ours, the sun as witness." And they absolutely crush the Spanish army, effectively securing Chilean independence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to redefine what organizational resilience actually is.
Yes, exactly. I want you listening to imagine your company's core servers being completely wiped out overnight by a cyber attack. How your team reacts the next morning isn't determined by a motivational speech you give at 9 a.m. It is dictated entirely by the structural culture and protocols you built 6 months prior. How does a leader prevent panic?
By baking resilience into the DNA of the system. True leadership isn't about perfectly avoiding failure. That's a myth. True leadership is engineering your organization so that when a catastrophic failure inevitably happens, like a midnight ambush, the system absorbs it as a severe setback rather than a fatal blow.
So they were prepared to fail safely, in a way.
Exactly. Las Heras could execute that complex retreat in the dark because the chain of command, which was established way back in Mendoza, held firm. The discipline was structural, not just inspirational.
But a highly disciplined set-piece army only works if the enemy fights the same way. With Chile secure, San Martin shifts his focus to the final boss, Peru. And the math here dictates a total change in philosophy. The sources note that Peru is occupied by an armed royalist force of nearly 23,000 soldiers.
Which is massive.
San Martin's army of the Andes only has about 4,000 men left, plus a navy. He is outnumbered roughly 4-1.
Yeah, so marching a 4,000-man army into a 23,000-man set-piece battle is tactical suicide. The methods that won Chile would absolutely fail in Peru. So San Martin completely abandons open warfare and embraces extreme asymmetry.
He moves his army up the coast by sea. But instead of attacking Lima directly, he just sits outside of it. He starts hollowing out the Spanish position from the inside.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, he sends commanders into the mountains to spark rebellions among the native populations. He launches massive psychological operations, promising emancipation to any enslaved people who desert their royalist masters to join his forces.
Ah, so he is waging a war of attrition. He's choking off Lima's supply lines, creating widespread paranoia among the royalist elite, and draining their manpower without firing a shot in a major field battle.
And it works perfectly. The pressure becomes so immense that the Spanish viceroy simply abandons Lima. San Martin walks into the capital without having to burn it to the ground. In July 1821, he officially declares the independence of Peru and is appointed the protector of Peru.
A huge title.
Yeah, and he immediately uses that power to enact sweeping reforms, abolishing the brutal Mita system of forced native labor, ending the Inquisition, and enacting the freedom of wombs, meaning that children of slaves are born free.
But declaring independence in Lima was not the same as winning the war.
Right.
The massive royalist army had just retreated into the mountains. They were waiting. Meanwhile, San Martin's army was bogged down, diseases were spreading, and crucially, he was receiving absolutely zero support or reinforcements from his home government in Buenos Aires.
Because Argentina was busy tearing itself apart in a civil war.
Exactly. He is completely isolated. He needs a miracle. And that brings us to the great climax of this history, the Guayaquil Conference in July 1822. San Martin travels north to meet the other titan of South American independence, Simón Bolívar, who had just liberated Colombia and Venezuela.
It remains one of the most heavily debated meetings in modern history. The two most powerful men on the continent finally meet face to face. I've always heard this described like two undisputed heavyweight champions finally meeting in the ring.
Oh, that's a popular way to look at it.
But let's upgrade that analogy. This is more like a massive corporate merger. You have two visionary CEOs who have conquered their respective markets. But they both realize that a dual leadership model will inevitably bankrupt the newly merged company.
Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Exactly. They go into a room, close the doors, no witnesses, no transcripts, and when the doors open, San Martin steps down. He resigns as protector and leaves the entire operation to Bolívar.
This raises an important question. What actually drove that decision? Because we lack a transcript, we have to look at the geopolitical leverage in the room. And the leverage was overwhelmingly on Bolívar's side.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. History paints this as a remarkably noble, ego-free sacrifice. But wasn't this just a pragmatic surrender? Bolívar had a massive, well-supplied army and the backing of a unified Colombian government. San Martin was broke, politically abandoned by Argentina, and struggling to hold Lima. Didn't he just realize he was completely outgunned and quit to save face?
It's a vital distinction to make. San Martin certainly asked Bolívar for troops to finish the war in Peru, but Bolívar refused to send his army unless he was in absolute command.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. San Martin actually offered to serve as Bolívar's subordinate, but Bolívar rejected that too, knowing the Peruvians would never accept their protector taking orders from a Colombian, so you have a geopolitical gridlock.
A total stalemate.
Right. But the nobility comes from how San Martin resolved it. He deeply feared the balkanization of the continent, that it would shatter into endless, petty warring fiefdoms if two massive egos tried to share power.
So he removes the friction by removing himself. He realizes that the ultimate mission, the total eradication of Spanish power in South America, is more important than his personal legacy as the guy who crossed the finish line.
Exactly. I mean, it is a profound act of political renunciation. He understood that his continued presence with his own loyal army and political factions would inevitably spark a continental civil war against Bolívar's forces once the Spanish were gone.
But giving up the CEO title is one thing. Where do you actually go on Monday morning when you are no longer the liberator? The sources make it clear that the most agonizing choices of his life were waiting for him back home.
Because home was a war zone. When he returns to Argentina, the United Provinces are engulfed in a brutal civil war between the Unitarians, who want centralized power in Buenos Aires, and the Federalists, who want provincial autonomy. Both factions aggressively demand that San Martin use his immense prestige and his returning troops to crush their political enemies.
And he draws an absolute, uncrossable line. He refuses to draw his sword against his own countrymen. He will not be the weapon that Argentines use to kill other Argentines.
Which naturally enrages the government in Buenos Aires. They view his neutrality as a treasonous lack of loyalty. And amidst this political venom, his personal life collapses. His wife, Remedios, who had stayed behind in Buenos Aires for years due to failing health, passes away in 1823 before he can reach her.
It's just tragic. So he takes his young daughter, Mercedes, and boards a ship to Europe. He spends his final decades moving between Britain, Brussels, and eventually France. He lives a quiet, almost anonymous life, battling severe health issues and going nearly blind.
He really just faded into the background.
He does occasionally intervene from afar, though. Like he offered his services to Argentine leader Juan Manuel de Rosas when European powers blockaded Argentina, but he strictly stays out of internal politics.
He even bequeaths his famous curved saber to Rosas, not as an endorsement of Rosas's internal policies, but strictly as a symbol of defending national sovereignty against foreign intervention. We have to be careful to note that he wasn't picking a side in the Civil War there.
Right, just impartially reporting what he did. So what does this all mean? Look at how this story ends. He dies in a rented room in Boulogne-sur-Mer, France in 1850. And his body isn't even repatriated to Argentina until 1880, 30 years later.
30 years?
Yeah. The sources note this delay was largely due to lingering political spite, but also because of intense rumors that he was a Freemason.
Which is a crucial context point. In early 19th century Latin America, Freemasonry wasn't just a fraternal club. It was deeply intertwined with anti-clerical, enlightenment-driven independence movements. The Catholic Church held immense institutional power, and they viewed Masonic lodges like the Rational Knights he belonged to as dangerous, radical threats to the established order.
Oh, I see.
So even in death, his ideological associations made him a deeply controversial figure to the conservative establishments back home.
We started this deep dive looking for a military tactician, and we uncovered a master systems engineer. He went from a decorated insider of the Spanish Empire to the visionary who turned Mendoza into a meticulously structured war machine.
It's quite the journey.
He led an army of emancipated slaves over the frozen Andes, rebounded from devastating ambushes because he baked resilience into his organizational culture, and broke the Spanish grip on Peru through asymmetric psychological warfare.
And then, at the absolute summit of his power, he possessed the rare, vital self-awareness to recognize that the greatest strategic move he could make for the cause was to permanently walk off the board.
It challenges everything our modern culture tells us about ambition and legacy. So if you're listening right now, look at your own life and your own projects. Where are you currently pushing forward using brute force, insisting on being the indispensable hero of the story, when strategic patience, or perhaps a well-timed, graceful exit, might actually be the most effective way to achieve your ultimate goal?
It is the hardest lesson in leadership. Knowing how to fight is important, but knowing exactly when to stop fighting is true mastery.
And that leaves us with one final thought to ponder. Think back to that closed-door meeting in Guayaquil. The two undisputed titans of the continent, deadlocked over the future. If a secret verbatim transcript of that meeting between San Martin and Bolivar were suddenly discovered in a dusty archive tomorrow, well, would it reveal a strategic masterclass in ego negotiation and mutual respect? Or would it be a stark, tragic admission of the absolute limits of what one individual can actually do to shape the destiny of a continent? Think about that the next time you find yourself walking into a closed-door meeting of your own.